He said those words that shocked me. He said he was in love with me as a woman. His actions just dissolved me. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after a long, exhausting day. I had just put James to bed, tucking him in with the same care I'd shown since he was a baby. He was growing up so fast, his once round cheeks now sharpening into something closer to a young man than the little boy I remembered. Too fast, I thought, sighing as I collapsed onto the couch, my body aching from the weight of both work and motherhood. The TV played softly in the background, but I wasn't really watching. My mind was elsewhere, wandering through the fog of my thoughts, work deadlines, bills, the emptiness that seemed to linger in the corners of our home. And then, there it was, the soft knock on my bedroom door. I turned my head, heart skipping a beat. "Come in," I called, though my voice was barely above a whisper. The door creaked open, and there he stood, James, his face shadowed by the dim light of the hallway. His shoulders were slumped, and his hands were fidgeting at his sides. He looked lost, like he was searching for something he couldn't quite name. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked, sitting up straighter, my maternal instincts kicking in. "Something's off. He never comes to my room like this anymore." He hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor. I couldn't sleep," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "Come here," I said softly, patting the space beside me on the couch. He shuffled over, his movements slow and uncertain, and sat down. I could feel the tension radiating off him even before he spoke again. "Mom," he began, his voice trembling, "I've been thinking a lot about Dad." My chest tightened at the mention of his father. It had been years since he'd left us, years since he'd walked out the door without so much as a backward glance. I'd tried to shield James from the worst of it, to protect him from the hurt and betrayal, but I knew it had scarred him in ways I couldn't completely heal. "What about him, honey?" I asked gently, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. He looked up at me then, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I keep wondering if it was my fault, if I did something to make him leave." My heart shattered in that moment. "Oh, James." "No, baby," I said, my voice firm but tender. "It wasn't your fault. Your father, he made his choices, and they had nothing to do with you. You are, the best thing that's ever happened to me." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't fully believe me. The guilt was still there, buried deep, and I hated that he carried it. I wanted to take it away, to shoulder it for him, but I knew it wasn't that simple. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of his words hanging in the air between us, and then, slowly, he leaned into me, his head resting on my shoulder. His body relaxed, and I could feel the tension draining out of him as I wrapped my arms around him, holding him close. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt the same stillness within myself. The worries that had been clawing at me earlier seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. This, I thought, is what matters. The morning came too soon, the sunlight streaming through the curtains and pulling me from a restless sleep. James was still asleep beside me, his breathing slow and even. I watched him for a moment, marveling at how peaceful he looked, and then I carefully slipped out of bed to start the day. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, less oppressive, more like a blank canvas waiting to be painted. I moved through my morning routine on autopilot, making coffee and toast, the smell of both filling the small kitchen. James appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice still thick with sleep. "Morning, sweetheart," I replied, smiling as I handed him a plate. "Hungry?" He nodded, taking the plate and sitting down at the table. We ate in companionable silence, the events of the previous night hanging between us like an unspoken promise. And then, out of nowhere, he spoke again. "Mom, last night, I just want you to know, I love you more than anything." His words caught me off guard, and I felt my eyes welling up with tears. "I love you too, James," I said, my voice breaking. "More than anything." He reached across the table, his hand finding mine, and we stayed like that for a moment, just holding on. The day unfolded slowly, each moment stretching out like a lazy afternoon. We spent it together, just the two of us, and it felt different. There was an ease between us that hadn't been there before, a closeness that went beyond the usual mother-son bond. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we found ourselves sitting on the front porch, the cool evening air wrapping around us like a blanket. James was quiet again, but this time, I could tell he was thinking about something important. "Mom," he said finally, turning to me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "I need to tell you something." "What is it, honey?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. He took a deep breath, his gaze locking with mine. I'm in love with you, not just as my mom, but as a woman." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Did he just say what I think he said? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but my heart was already betraying me, pounding wildly in my chest. I could feel the warmth of his gaze on me, searching for something, anything, in my reaction. "James," I started, my voice trembling. That's not something you should say." He leaned closer, his hand reaching out to rest on mine. His touch sent a shiver up my arm, and I couldn't pull away. Why couldn't I pull away? "I know it's not," he said softly, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "But it's the truth, and I don't want to hide it anymore." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "James, this isn't right. We're mother and son. This isn't how things are supposed to be." "Why not?" he asked, his voice rising just enough to make me flinch. "Why does it have to be wrong? Mom, I've watched you and Dad, you were never happy with him. Not really. I could see it, and I hated it. I hated him for making you feel like you weren't enough, but you've always been enough for me. More than enough." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I blinked them away. How could he see so much? How could he understand what I'd tried so hard to hide? "James, it's not that simple. You're young. You don't know what you're saying." "I'm not a kid anymore," he said firmly, his hand tightening around mine. "I know what I feel, and I know I'm not imagining this. The way you look at me sometimes, the way you touch me, it's not just motherly love. I see it, Mom. I feel it." My heart stopped. Did he? Had I been so careless? I thought I'd buried those feelings deep, locked them away where they could never see the light of day. But maybe he was right. Maybe I hadn't been as careful as I thought. "James," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "This is dangerous. People won't understand. They'll judge us. They'll hate us." "I don't care about them," he said fiercely, his eyes blazing with a determination that took my breath away. "I care about you, only you." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, and he reached up to brush it away, his touch so gentle it made my heart ache. "Mom," he said, his voice soft now, almost pleading, "please, tell me I'm not alone in this." I closed my eyes, trying to gather my thoughts, but all I could feel was the warmth of his hand on my face, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Was he alone? Was I? "You're not," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "You're not alone, James." He let out a shaky breath, his forehead resting against mine. "Then let me love you," he whispered. "Let me show you how much you mean to me." I could feel his breath on my lips, and my heart was beating so fast, I thought it might burst. This is wrong. This is so wrong. But it didn't feel wrong. Felt inevitable, like we'd been heading toward this moment all along. I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was him. But suddenly, his lips were on mine, and the world stopped. His kiss was soft at first, tentative, like he was afraid I might pull away. And I should have. I knew I should have, but I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back, my hands tangling in his hair as I pulled him closer. It wasn't just a kiss. It was everything. Every unspoken word, every hidden desire, every moment of loneliness and longing poured into that single touch. I could feel his hands on my waist, his body pressing against mine, and I moaned softly into his mouth, the sound surprising even me. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes dark with need. "Mom," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you so much." "James," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and desire. We shouldn't "I know," he said, cutting me off, "but I can't help it. I don't want to." I didn't know what to say. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to push him away, but my body had other ideas. I could feel the heat building between us, the way his hands gripped my hips, pulling me closer, and I wanted him. God help me, I wanted him. "James," I said again, but this time it wasn't a protest. It was a plea. He understood. He always did. His lips found mine again, and this time there was no hesitation. His kiss was hungry, desperate, and I matched him, my hands roaming over his back, exploring the hard planes of his body. I could feel his arousal pressing against me, and it only made me want him more. He broke the kiss and trailed his lips down my neck, his teeth grazing my skin in a way that sent shivers down my spine. "Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "I need you." "James," I gasped, my hands clutching at his shoulders. "We can't. Not here." Pulled back, his eyes meeting mine, and I could see the question in them. "Then where?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me, Mom. Follow you anywhere." I hesitated for just a moment before taking his hand and leading him inside. The house was quiet, the only sound our footsteps on the hardwood floor as we made our way to my bedroom. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but I didn't stop. I couldn't, not now, not when he was so close. Once we were inside, closed the door behind us and turned to face him. He looked at me, his eyes dark with desire, and I could see how much he wanted me, how much he needed me, and I needed him too. More than I'd ever admitted, even to myself. He didn't wait for me to speak. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, pulled me into his arms, his lips crashing down on mine. This kiss was different, deeper, more urgent. I could feel the heat of his body, the way his hands roamed over me, exploring every inch of my body like he was memorizing it. "Mom," he moaned against my lips, his hands sliding under my shirt. "You're so beautiful." "James," I gasped, my hands fumbling with the buttons of his shirt. "Please." He didn't need to be told twice, pulled the shirt over his head and tossed it aside, revealing the hard planes of his chest. I ran my hands over his skin, feeling the warmth of his body, the way his muscles tensed under my touch. He groaned softly, his hands moving to the hem of my shirt, pulling it up and over my head. I stood there in just my bra and jeans, feeling more exposed than I ever had. But the way he looked at me, it wasn't just desire, it was adoration. "Love, you're perfect," he whispered, his hands sliding around to the clasp of my bra. "So perfect." "James," I breathed, my heart racing as he unhooked my bra and let it fall to the floor. But he didn't let me finish. His hands were on my breasts, his thumbs brushing over my nipples in a way that made me gasp. "Mom," he said, his voice rough with need, "I want you, all of you." "James," I moaned, my hands gripping his shoulders as he lowered his head and took one of my nipples into his mouth. The sensation was electric, sending jolts of pleasure straight to my core. "Oh, God." He sucked and teased, his other hand working its way down to the waistband of my jeans. I could feel his fingers fumbling with the button and then the zipper, and then his hand was sliding inside, cupping me through my panties. "Mom," he groaned, his fingers pressing against my most sensitive spot. "You're so wet." "James," I gasped, my hips arching into his touch. "Please." He didn't need to be told twice. He hooked his fingers in my panties and pulled them down, leaving me completely exposed. And then his hand was back, his fingers sliding inside me, and I cried out, my hands clutching at his shoulders for support. "That's it," he whispered, his fingers moving in and out of me in a rhythm that had me seeing stars. "Let me make you feel good, Mom." "James," I moaned, my head falling back as pleasure consumed me. I can't." "Yes, you can," he said, his voice firm. "Come for me, Mom." His name slipped from my lips again, this time as a breathless whisper. "James." The way he touched me, the way his fingers moved inside me with such confidence, it was overwhelming, intoxicating. My body trembled, every nerve alight with sensations I hadn't felt in years. "James," I moaned again, my voice trembling as much as my legs. I'm so close. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Desire? Love? Maybe both. Let go, Mom, he urged softly, his voice steady despite the intensity of what we were doing. I've got you. And then it happened. Like a dam breaking, my body convulsed, waves of pleasure crashing over me in rapid succession. I cried out, clutching at him as if he were the only thing keeping me grounded. His name spilled from my lips over and over, a mantra that seemed to anchor me to the moment. James, James, James. When the tremors finally subsided, I collapsed against him, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. His fingers were still inside me, slowly easing out as he held me close. That was incredible, I murmured, my voice barely audible, pressed a soft kiss to my forehead, his lips lingering there for a moment. You're incredible, he whispered back, his words sending a shiver down my spine. How could this be happening? Thought, my mind still reeling. My son, my James. But before I could fully process it, he was moving again, his hands sliding down my body until they reached the waistband of his own pants. I watched, my heart pounding, as he unbuttoned them and pushed them down, revealing the hard length of him. God, he's beautiful, I thought, unable to tear my eyes away. Mom, he said, his voice thick with need. I want you, all of you. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Are you sure? I asked, my voice trembling. We can't take this back, James. Once we do this, he cupped my face in his hands, his gaze steady and unflinching. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, he said firmly. I love you, Mom, not just as my mother, but as a woman, and I want to be with you completely. His words sent a jolt through me, and I nodded, my resolve solidifying. Then take me, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Make me yours. He didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, he positioned himself at my entrance, his eyes never leaving mine. Are you ready? He asked, his voice soft, filled with anticipation. I nodded, my breath catching in my throat. Yes, I whispered, please. And then he was inside me, slowly, carefully, as if he were afraid of hurting me. Oh God, I thought, my vision blurring as I felt him fill me completely. It had been so long since I'd been with anyone like this, and the sensation was overwhelming. James, I gasped, my hands clutching at his back. You feel amazing. He groaned, burying his face in the crook of my neck as he began to move. His rhythm was steady, deliberate, each thrust sending waves of pleasure coursing through me. I arched my back, my body instinctively seeking more, craving the connection only he could give me. Mom, he whispered against my skin, his breath hot and ragged. I love you so much. I love you too, I breathed, my voice trembling with emotion. More than anything, his pace quickened, his thrusts growing more urgent as we both teetered on the edge. I could feel the tension building inside me, pressure coiling tighter and tighter until I thought I might burst. James, I cried out, my fingers digging into his shoulders. I'm going to come with me, Mom, he urged, his voice strained. Let's do this together. And then it happened. An explosion of pleasure so intense, it felt like my entire body was on fire. I cried out, my back arching as waves of ecstasy crashed over me. He followed moments later, his body shuddering as he found his release inside me. Our cries mingled, a symphony of passion and love that echoed through the room. When it was over, we collapsed together, our bodies tangled and slick with sweat. He held me close, his arms wrapped tightly around me as we both struggled to catch our breath. That was, I began, but words failed me. How could I possibly describe what had just happened? Perfect, he finished for me, his voice soft, filled with certainty. It was perfect, Mom. I nodded, my heart swelling with emotion. He was right. It had been perfect, but as I lay there in his arms, thought crept into my mind, unbidden and unwelcome. What now? What did this mean for us, for our relationship, for our lives? As if sensing my unease, James tightened his hold on me, his lips brushing against my hair. Don't think about it, he murmured. Just be here with me. That's all that matters right now. Closed my eyes, letting his words soothe me. He was right. This moment was all that mattered. The rest could wait. For now, I would savor the warmth of his body against mine, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the love that had brought us to this point. But as I drifted off to sleep in his arms, I couldn't shake feeling that things were about to get even more complicated. What have we done? I thought, my heart aching with a mixture of joy and fear. And where do we go from here? I woke to the soft glow of morning light streaming through the curtains, James's arms still draped protectively over me. I could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest against my back, his breath warm on my neck. For a moment, I let myself just be, savoring the quiet intimacy of the moment. But the questions from last night crept back in, whispering doubts and fears I couldn't silence. What happens next? What does this mean for us? James stirred, his fingers tracing lazy patterns along my arm. Morning, he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. He pressed a soft kiss to my shoulder, sending a shiver down my spine. How'd you sleep? Better than I have in years, I admitted, turning to face him. His eyes were soft, filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. You? Like I was exactly where I was meant to be, he said, his voice steady, tinged with something deeper, something that made my stomach flutter. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face. You're so beautiful first thing in the morning. You know that? I laughed softly, shaking my head. Flatterer. Not flattery if it's true, he said, his hand lingering on my cheek. His thumb brushed over my bottom lip, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged, electric. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the intensity of it, and it made my breath catch. Brittany, he said, his voice low. Last night, it wasn't a mistake, was it? I hesitated, my heart pounding. Was it? I wasn't sure I could answer that. Part of me wanted to say yes, pull back and pretend none of it had happened. But the other part, the part that had craved this connection, this closeness, refused to let me. No, I whispered finally, my voice trembling. It wasn't a mistake. He let out a breath I didn't realize he'd been holding, his shoulders relaxing. Good, he said, his hand sliding down to rest on my hip. Because I don't think I could go back to how things were before. Not after last night. Neither could I admitted, my voice barely audible. The admission felt like a weight lifting off my chest, but it also brought a fresh wave of fear. Where does this leave us? What do we do now? As if reading my thoughts, James leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, in a kiss that was soft, full of intent. We'll figure it out, he said against my mouth. Together, I nodded, my fingers tangling in his hair as I deepened the kiss. His hands slid around my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space between us. The heat of his body, feel of his skin against mine, was intoxicating. I could feel the hunger in his touch, the way his fingers dug into my hips as if he couldn't get enough of me, and it awakened something deep inside me, something primal and raw. James, I breathed, my hands roaming over his chest, feeling the hard planes of muscle beneath my palms. I need you, he groaned, his forehead dropping to mine. You have no idea how much I've wanted to hear you say that, he said, his voice rough with desire. His hands moved lower, cupping my ass and pulling me even closer until I could feel the hard length of him pressing against me. Tell me again. I need you, I repeated, my voice shaking with need. Please. That was all it took. In one swift motion, he rolled me onto my back, his body covering mine, his lips crashing down on me in a kiss that stole my breath. His hands were everywhere, exploring, claiming, and I arched into his touch, craving more. When he finally entered me, it was with a slow, deliberate thrust that made me cry out, my nails digging into his back. You feel so good, he groaned, his hips moving in a rhythm that was both familiar and entirely new. So fucking perfect. I could barely think, barely breathe as pleasure coiled tighter and tighter inside me. Every thrust, every brush of his skin against mine sent me spiraling closer to the edge. James, I gasped, my hands clutching at his shoulders. Don't stop. He didn't. His pace quickened, his breaths coming in ragged gasps as he drove into me with a desperation that matched my own. And when I finally came, it was with his name on my lips, my body trembling beneath his. He followed moments later, his release shuddering through him as he buried his face in the crook of my neck. We lay there for what felt like forever, our bodies still tangled together, our breaths slowly returning to normal. James pressed a soft kiss to my shoulder, his fingers tracing absent patterns on my skin. "I love you, Brittany," he said quietly. "More than anything, I love you too," I whispered back, my voice thick with emotion. But even as I said the words, the questions from earlier lingered in the back of my mind. What now? What do we do? How do we navigate this? James must have sensed my unease because he propped himself up on one elbow, his free hand gently tilting my chin up so I was looking at him. "Hey," he said, his tone serious. "We'll figure this out. Together. I promise." I nodded, trying to push the doubts aside. He was right. We would figure it out. But as I lay there in his arms, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives were about to change in ways we couldn't even begin to imagine. The sound of the doorbell ringing downstairs broke the moment, and we both froze. I could feel James's body tense beside me, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "Are you expecting anyone?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, my heart suddenly racing. Not this early." James sat up, running a hand through his hair. "Should we answer it?" I hesitated, the possibilities running through my mind. Who could it be? A neighbor? A delivery? Or something? Someone else entirely? My stomach churned with anxiety, but I knew we couldn't just ignore it. "We'll have to," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his expression grim as he reached for his discarded clothes. "All right," he said, sliding out of bed, "but no matter who it is, we face it together. Deal?" "Deal," I agreed, my heart pounding as I followed his lead. As we made our way downstairs, the sound of the doorbell echoing through the house, I couldn't help feel like whatever was waiting for us on the other side of that door was about to change everything, for better or for worse. James reached the door first, his hand hovering over the knob. He glanced back at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and fear. "Ready?" he asked quietly. I took a deep breath, nodding. "Ready." He turned the knob, opening the door to reveal. James turned the knob, opening the door to reveal Mark, my ex-husband. The man I hadn't seen in over a decade stood there, older now, with lines etched into his face that hadn't been there when he left. His dark hair was streaked with gray, and his worn leather jacket hung loosely on his frame. His eyes, those same intense eyes James had inherited, flickered between us, narrowing slightly as he took in the scene. James standing protectively in front of me, my hand clutching the robe I'd hastily thrown on. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to steady it. "What are you doing here?" He shoved his hands into his pockets, shifting his weight awkwardly. "Hey, Brittany." "James." His voice was rough, deeper than I remembered, but there was a softness to it that caught me off guard. I figured it was time I came back to see you both." James's body tensed beside me, his jaw tightening. "Why now?" he asked, his voice low and edged with something I couldn't quite place. Anger, maybe, or disbelief. "You've been gone for years." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know it's been too long, but I couldn't stay away forever. I wanted to." He hesitated, his eyes flicking to me briefly before settling on James. "I wanted to make things right, or at least try." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. After all this time, after everything we'd been through, he just shows up at our door like this, like no time had passed at all? I felt James's hand brush against mine, a silent reassurance, but it did little to calm the storm inside me. "You think you can just waltz back into our lives?" James asked, his voice rising. "After everything you put Mom through? After everything you left behind?" Mark flinched, his shoulders slumping. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I had to try. I had to see if there was any chance I could make up for what I did." I stepped forward, placing a hand on James's arm. "Let's just hear him out," I said softly, though my own heart was pounding. James shot me a look, his eyes filled with doubt, but he nodded reluctantly. Mark stepped inside, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor. He glanced around the living room, his gaze lingering on the photos of James and me that lined the walls. "You've done well," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He's grown into a fine young man." "Yeah, Mom raised me," James snapped, his tone icy. "Not you," Mark winced, nodding slowly. "You're right," he said. "You're absolutely right. I wasn't there. I failed you both, but I'm here now, and I want to make things right, if you'll let me." I felt a lump form in my throat, my emotions swirling in a chaotic mess. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to tell him to leave and never come back. But another part ached for the man I'd once loved, the man who'd been such a big part of my life before he walked away. "Mark," I began, my voice trembling. This isn't easy. You can't just show up after all this time and expect everything to go back to the way it was." "I know," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "I don't expect that, but I'm willing to try, to earn back your trust. Both of you." James stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't get to just try," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't get to waltz back in here and act like everything's fine. You left, you abandoned us, and now you think you can just, be a part of our lives again?" Mark's shoulders slumped, and for a moment he looked broken. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly. "But I had to try. I had to see if there was any chance I could make things right." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, and I wiped them away quickly. "Mark," I said, my voice soft, this is a lot. We need time to process this, to figure out what this means." He nodded, his expression somber. "I understand. I'll leave you to it, but I'll be around if you want to talk." James stepped between us, his body tense. "You should go," he said firmly. "Now." Mark hesitated, his eyes flicking to me briefly before he nodded. "All right, I'll go, but I'm here if you need me." He turned and walked out the door, closing it softly behind him. The room fell silent, the weight of his presence lingering in the air like a heavy fog. I felt James's hand on my shoulder, and I turned to face him, tears streaming down my face. "Mom," he said softly, wrapping his arms around me. "It's okay. We'll figure this out, together." I nodded, burying my face in his shoulder. I don't know what to do," I whispered. "He's back, James. After all this time, he's back." James pulled back, his hands cupping my face as he looked into my eyes. "We'll figure it out," he said firmly. "But no matter what happens, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." I felt a surge of warmth flood through me, and I leaned in, pressing my lips to his in a soft, tender kiss. When we pulled away, I rested my forehead against his, my breath shaky. "I love you," I whispered. "I love you too," he murmured, his voice filled with determination. No matter what, as we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Mark's sudden reappearance had thrown everything into chaos, but one thing was certain. No matter what happened, James and I would face it together. For now, I just wanted to be with him, feel his warmth, his love, his strength. I leaned in, capturing his lips in another kiss, this one deeper, more urgent. His arms tightened around me, pulling me closer, and for a moment, everything else faded away. There was only us, only this, only now, and for now, that was enough.